Hey there, this is Sid and today we shall solve a SQL problem from StrataScratch. The title of the problem is Company with Most Desktop Only Users. It's listed as a medium difficulty problem and the ID of the problem is 2027. As always, we shall first have a look at the input table. I have exported the input table to Excel because that's where it's easiest to view. Once we have gone through the input table, we shall come back to this page and have a look at the problem statement. So here is our input table. It's called a fact underscore events table. It has 7 columns. An ID column which uniquely identifies each row of this events table. A time ID column which captures the date of when an event happened. A user ID column which captures the user ID of the person who created the event. And then a customer ID column. And then followed by a client ID column. The client ID column can have one of two values, desktop or mobile. Then an event type column and an event ID column. The event type describes the nature of the event, whether it was a message sent or a file received or a video call received. And the event ID is a one-to-one mapping between the event type and an integer. You can think of the event ID as sort of a code for the event type. So message sent will always have the code 3, file received will always have the code 2, and so on. For the purposes of this problem, only these 3 columns that I have just highlighted, user ID, customer ID, and client ID, will be of use. Now let's go back to the problem statement. It says that write a query that returns the company means the customer ID column, with the highest number of users that use desktop only. So each company will have users who use desktops as well as mobiles. There may be some users who will use only desktop or only mobile. So what the problem is asking us to do is find out those companies which have the highest number of desktop only users. So going back to the Excel file, as you can see, a given user, for example this user, is using a desktop in this row, the first row, whereas the same user is using a mobile in this row, the row identified by the ID 19. So we are not interested in those kinds of users. We are interested only in those users who use desktop only. Once we have found out those users, the next thing that we have to do is find out the organizations. The organization is the same thing as the company in the problem statement. So the next thing that we have to do is find out those organizations which have the maximum number of desktop users. So let me first walk you through a solution of this problem in Microsoft Excel. I have created a pivot table here. So in this pivot table, the column I starting from this row onward gives us the user IDs, that is the column C. And then in columns J and K, we have the number of times that particular user used a desktop and a mobile respectively. So for example, this user appeared a total of 5 times, out of which 3 times was through a desktop and 2 times was through a mobile phone. This user also appeared a total of 5 times, out of which once was through a desktop and 4 times was through a mobile. So once I have listed all the users, I eyeball through column K and find out where there are blanks. If there is a blank in column K, that would mean that that user, the user in that row, used only a desktop but did not use a mobile. So I find 2 such users here. I have highlighted those 2 users in green. So these 2 users are the users of our interest. So once we have found out the users who are desktop only users, what we do next is we go back to the original input table and filter that input table using the user ID column and the 2 user IDs who are desktop only users on that column. So once you filter out this input table using these 2 users, you arrive at this smaller table here. I have kept only the user ID, the customer ID and the client ID column from the original table because the others are not of any relevance. In fact, the client ID column is also not of any use because we already know that the client will always be desktop because that's how the user IDs were chosen. Now once we have this small table, we can immediately see that sendit, which appears thrice in this small table, has 2 distinct users. This is one user and this is the second user. This third user is again a repetition of the first user. So the first user logged back in again via sendit. So sendit has 2 unique users, this and this. And similarly, connectix also has two distinct users, this and this. The last one is again a repeat user. So the final answer would be connectix and sendit, each of them having two distinct users. Now in the question, they have only asked us for the company names, not for the counts. So the expected output lists only connectix and sendit. So I hope we now understand the problem statement and how to solve the problem in Microsoft Excel. Now let's try to translate this solution into the language of SQL. As always, I have written the SQL code in Notepad++ because that's where it is easiest to understand. I have used a CTE here, and then I have applied a query on that CTE. It's not too difficult to understand, but it's a bit complicated. So let's go at it one at a time. Let's start off with the innermost query here. What is this innermost query doing? This innermost query is giving us the list of all user IDs from the fact events where the client ID is a desktop. Now if we run this query in the StrataScratch editor window, you will see that the output lists some user IDs. But make no mistake that this is not a desktop only user ID. All this output says is that these user IDs also used a desktop. Whether they used a mobile device or not is not evident from this output. So bear this in mind. All this output gives us this list of user IDs is that these user IDs definitely used a desktop, regardless or not whether they used a mobile or not. Now let's go back to the query again. Now consider the next query here. This query is finding out for each user ID what is the count of distinct client IDs. So you'd expect the count of distinct client IDs to be either 1 or 2, because each user ID can use either a mobile device only or a desktop only, or both a mobile device as well as a desktop. In the first two cases, the count will be 1 because they're using only a mobile or a desktop, whereas in the last case, the count will be 2. So as it stands, this query would have given us the user ID followed by the count of the distinct client IDs. But we have used a where condition here. In the where condition, we have limited or restricted the user IDs to those user IDs who are definitely using a desktop. So now this creates a very important distinction. Now if we run this query, we will get the user IDs along with the count of the distinct client IDs, but we can be assured that each of those user IDs definitely used a desktop, regardless of whether they used a mobile or not. Let's go back to the SQL editor and run this query. So now these user ID and the counts that you are getting are only for those users who we know have used a desktop. So for example, this user has used two distinct clients. So obviously he or she has used a mobile as well as a desktop. However, this user has used only one device. That has to be a desktop because, as we pointed out, we have applied an additional filter on the user ID to ensure that our users definitely has used a desktop. Without this condition on the user ID, we would not have been able to tell with certainty whether this user, although he used only one device, was using a mobile or a desktop. But given that we know that all of these users have used a desktop, so when we see a client count of 1, we know that that must be a desktop. So I hope you understand this inner query now. So once you understand the inner query, this city is very simple to understand. All this city is now saying is, okay, you had the user IDs with the counts of distinct clients in the highlighted query, right? But we have just assured ourselves that those user IDs must have used at least a desktop, regardless of whether they used a mobile or not. So now if on top of that, I use a separate condition saying that the client ID is 1, that will ensure that those users have used only desktop. because all along we have considered those users who have at least used a desktop. So once you put this client count is equal to 1 condition, you are left with only desktop users. So this is what this CTE is doing. Let us quickly copy this query and run it in the SQL editor and see what we get here. So if you look at it, we are getting these two users ending with SNQYZ and MYFRB. If you come back here, we have SNQYZ and MYFRB. So we have been able to pluck out the desktop only users successfully. Now the rest of the CTE is very straightforward. All it is doing is, again, there is an inner query here. That's why I said that it's a bit complicated but not really complex. So what this query is doing is, it is saying, okay, give me the customer IDs. Now remember, the customer IDs are the company names like Sendit, Connectix, Zoomit, etc. So this query is saying that give me the company name along with the count of the distinct user IDs. So for each company, how many distinct users are there? But make sure that those users belong to this list of desktop only users here. So that condition is implemented by saying user ID in select user ID from desktop only users. So this part of the query is giving us the company name along with the count of distinct user IDs, because we don't want to count a repeat user twice. So this query is giving us the company name along with the count of the distinct user ID, ensuring that those user IDs are the desktop only users. And the reason that I have put this inside a subquery is because this query by itself would give us the company name along with the count of the distinct users. So it would say company name followed by the number 2. But we don't really want that. We just want the company name. So I have put this inside a subquery and extracted only the customer ID from the subquery. Customer ID is the company name. So let us go back to the SQL editor and run the full query. If we run the full query, we see that the customer ID, Connectix and Sendit are returned, which is the same as the output provided by StrataScratch. So I hope I was able to explain the solution to this problem. I'll keep coming back with solutions to more SQL problems from StrataScratch. So please stay tuned.